Good morning. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm head of events at Agora Energiewende, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's online event. During the next 2 hours, we're going to present a policy action plan to phase out coal in the EU power system by 2030. Now, why is that? Well, if we want to reduce emissions by minus 55% by 2030, we have to get out of coal by 2032. And how could that be? Well, this is a question that we asked ourselves at Agora Energiewende too. And we tasked the consultancy Enervis energy advisors to develop 2030 coal phase-out scenarios and bring them together in a study. And this study was published, I believe, 2 weeks ago on our website. But if you haven't found the time to go through it yet, you're lucky because we have some of the authors on the podium today. And also, we have managed to get together a panel that will discuss about the findings of the study in a panel discussion at the end of the event. But before diving into the study, let us look at the broader picture. And for that, we have asked our colleague Michaela Holl, who is project lead at the EU Green Deal and part of our Agora's EU team working from Brussels, to give us a broader view and tell the audience about policy implications for the EU's net zero target, as stated in the program. Michaela, I'd like to hand over the microphone to you for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Hello, everybody from very rainy and autumny Brussels today. It's a pleasure to open this webinar. Exciting times to be alive, in particular for energy policy people or for people who have a knack for net zero scenarios, or both. What has recently happened? Well, in 2020, we saw renewables overtaking fossil fuels in the EU electricity production for the first time. That was last year. Also last year, the climate target plan increased the ambition for the EU for 2030. And the climate law entered into force this summer, and it obliged both EU institutions and member states to take all necessary measures to reduce net domestic greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by at least 55% compared to 1990. The International Energy Agency, earlier this year, not just now, that was a different one, published its global net zero modeling. And it came with milestones. One of them being that unabated coal will need to be phased out by 2030 in advanced economies and around the globe 10 years later by 2040. Then over the summer, a perfect storm created based on very high gas prices and tight supply, a post-COVID recovery and connected high energy demand. And somehow this created the first bump of Europe's journey on the road of the Green Deal. We see record high electricity and gas prices. And we also saw that coal capacities came back into the system in the EU power production. And as a consequence, we saw a big rebound of global power sector emissions that actually are now above pre-pandemic levels. Also, and here I'm quoting the think tank Amber, it became clear that no country has yet achieved a truly green recovery for their power sector. So what I take from this being the energy price crisis we had just now, but also this rebound in emissions, makes one thing very clear, that a coal phase out needs several components in order to be worked. It might be feasible that a coal phase out happens only based on ETS prices. We saw very high ones, which are in the area that you would need for it to become uneconomical. But such a signal is also very volatile. And so it needs framing by other policy instruments to be actually of perpetual nature. And secondly, what we also saw is that whilst maybe a market price signal guarantees a phase out of an uneconomic coal production, it does not necessarily also mean that in the same time you have the appropriate phase in of what needs to replace it. And that should be to a large extent renewables. So in fact, we have a huge renewables challenge ahead in Europe, because the new target basically means we need, again, 20% more renewables in the energy consumption. But this time round, we only have 10 years to get there, not 20. Also for the power sector, more or less, we need to double the current share. The switch from coal to clean in the power sector never made more sense than these days. And we are happy to have this seminar. It happens a few days ahead of the COP26. It actually happens just a few days after, in Germany, signs emerged from early talks of a possible new coalition government that the date of the exit from coal in Europe's biggest economy might be advanced. It's currently 2038 to 2030. And that is also one of the countries we included in our study. So basically, Nicolas said we published a study 2 weeks ago, and it's already outdated by developments. But I think that is good news in this context. The UK announced as its contribution for the COP26 that it will have a carbon-free power sector by 2035. That is also what the IEA set as a milestone of where we should be if we want to keep the path for 1.5 degrees. So with all of this happening, and in this context, we hope to make our contribution to a coal-free EU electricity sector by 2030 with this discussion and panel. And I'm looking forward to hear more about the modeling, etc., that we will now going to see from my colleagues and from Enervis. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Michaela, for this broader picture of the larger implications of the EU's road to net zero for the policy environment. Now, as I said, we're very lucky that we have the main authors on our panel. And I'd like to start with Julius Ecke, who's partner at the consultancy Enervis Energy Advisors and has been working on the scenarios. Dear Julius, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to present today our results on power system scenarios for a European coal exit by 2030. I guess to get to minus 55%, many things need to happen. Some things we know, some things we don't know yet. And one thing we know quite clear is coal exit. But we wanted to contribute to the discussion by developing an additional view on how coal exit could be reached from a kind of techno-economical point of view, and what kind of policy mixes could be utilized, and what their specific characteristics would be to reach such a result, coal exit 2030. Let me quickly dive a bit into the methodology and the scenarios of this study. So in this study, we conducted power market modeling on the number of different policies scenarios to reach a minus 55% target in 2030 in the power sector. So for each scenario, we conducted modeling of power plant dispatch and investment behavior, and then looked at specific indicators of merit of those scenarios. So like costs, like emissions, like investment needs, and so on. Important to note that we looked at the power market. So we excluded other sectors like heating, transport from our modeling. As always, when it comes to modeling studies, the scenario definition and the parameterization is important. So let's dive a bit into the underlying scenarios. One first scenario we called policy mix 40% represents the former European Union carbon limitation ambition level. So this scenario is mostly used as a baseline to measure the impact of the more ambitious scenarios. And of those we have three.
Julius, sorry to interrupt you. Are you already showing the slides? Because we don't see them yet. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Should. That's a good. Thanks for the note. Now should work, no?
It does. Yes, we see everything. Thank you.
So we have three other scenarios, which represent more ambitious policy limitation approach. The 55% policy mix scenario represents more or less balanced mix of market and policy-driven drivers to reach minus 55% emission level. So this scenario includes a regulated coal exit and subsidies to expand renewables accordingly, alongside a certain incentive by ETS prices on the level of 54 euro per ton in 2030. Then we have a 55% market-based coal exit scenario. This scenario assumes that a stronger increase in ETS prices eliminates coal-based generation by the end of 2030. So ETS drives coal exit, but ETS prices don't necessarily drive renewable expansion alone. So there's still the need and the assumption that it's happened that renewable expansion is subsidized wherever necessary. The third scenario is our 55 market-based coal to clean scenario. Here we assume that the power market transition is caused by CO2 prices alone. So no additional policies like coal exit related or renewable energy expansion related are assumed to be in place here. So overall, these three scenarios represent different distribution of policy and ETS ambition, right? With more policy in the first scenario and much less policy and more ETS price as in the driver's seat, so to speak, in the last of the three. Note on the regional scope, in all scenarios, we modeled the whole of the European Union, but the focus of our analysis and this presentation today will be on the countries with the most relevant coal capacities that have not yet settled on a coal exit by 2030. Those are called Coal 6 in the following, and the presentation focuses on the results for those 6 most relevant countries. Let's have a look at one of the most important characteristics of these scenarios, the assumed CO2 price. This slide shows the stark difference in CO2 prices resulting from this scenario setup. So I'm quickly going to go through those 4 scenarios. Whereas a price level of 35 euro per ton might have been enough to align the power market with a 40% reduction target, so kind of the outdated reduction target. To get to minus 55%, we need in our modeling a range of prices in between 54 and 150 euro per ton, depending on the assumed policy setup. So clearly, the less regulation and policy is driving the overall development, the higher the ETS price needs to be to align the power sector with the minus 55% reduction target. 54 euro per ton work with strong policies to support the overall effort. Our modeling indicates that sustained CO2 prices above that level, so sustained CO2 prices at 65 euro per ton, alongside the necessary renewable energy expansion, could lead to a market-driven coal phase-out. Without any additional regulations, so no renewable subsidies, CO2 prices of up to 150 euro per ton would be necessary. So clearly, a market-based coal exit is in the reach. Market-based renewable expansion is still quite a bit further out when it comes to CO2 prices in our modeling. Please maybe make a mental note, right? The scenario setup, especially things like gas prices, date back to, I think, beginning of this year, certainly date back before the recent development when it comes to gas prices. So things like, I would say, market-based coal exit at 65 euro per ton probably would have to be a bit adjusted to reflect current gas prices, which have an effect on these kind of numbers. So these kind of differences in incentives result in different capacity structures and dispatch results. So we quickly want to have a look at those for the coal 6 countries. So this slide shows capacity and generation in our 4 different scenarios for each 2020, 25, and 2030. Capacity on the left, generation on the right, each aggregated for the coal 6 countries. Let's have a look at the underlying capacities on the left first. In the modeling, I'm focusing on the 2030 numbers first. So in the modeling, phase out of a remaining 38 gigawatt of coal capacities in 2030 needs to happen to go to a coal exit. In the modeling, this is met with roughly 100 gigawatt of additional wind onshore and PV. We go with wind onshore here because we assume that until 2030, most of the renewable flexibility, the additional supply, would come from onshore and PV. Quick side note, the stronger the role of ETS prices, the higher the overall renewable expansion, because higher ETS price trigger additional market-based renewables overall. So there's a bit more renewables happening in scenarios with a strong ETS price in the driver's seat. Maybe a quick side note, you still see a bit of coal in the 2030 numbers. This is mostly because we assume that the coal exit happens at the end of 2030. So within the calendar year 2030, there's still some residual capacity left. A note on the gas, to compensate part of the reduction in coal capacity, gas plays an important role. So within the market, we see an additional 11 to 25 gigawatt of gas capacities being deployed. The residual flexibility that would be needed would have to be provided by demand-side management, storage, stronger cross-border trading, and reserve capacities if regulators and policymakers should see fit. The figure on the right displays the generation mix for the coal 6 countries, again, from 2020 to 2030. The different colored bars represent technologies, and the blue line represents the share of renewables on overall demand. So as a consequence of the coal exit and the additional renewable expansion, the generation mix becomes less carbon intensive in the 55% scenarios, clearly. So much less coal, more renewables, and that compensate for that. Renewable shares on demand increased by roughly over 5 percentage points by 2030 against the baseline. It's important to note, though, that already in the 40% scenario, that's our baseline, our reference, coal generation has decreased quite a bit. So there's much less coal happening in the 40% already. So much less coal needs to be compensated for in the 55% scenarios. So to sum it up, 55% scenarios are generally quite similar, independently of the policy mix. Coal exit, to a large degree at least, happens in the calendar year 2030, much more renewables, some additional gas, more or less independently of the underlying policy mix. Let's have a look into some of the major results when it comes to emissions, costs, and other important policy elements. From this slide onwards, we will mostly look at scenario differences to highlight the additional effect of our 55% scenarios versus the baseline 40% scenario. So this slide shows 2 of the major results when it comes to the policy debate, I guess. On the left, you see total emissions. On the right, you see an important cost indicator. I will quickly talk you through it. So on the left, we showed the total abatement of our 55% scenarios against the 40% scenario. And this is cumulated numbers over 2020 to 2030. So this is really the overall abatement in CO2 emissions against the 40% scenario, which already sees a certain amount of abatement happening. You can see that this is roughly in the range of 950 million to 1.4 billion tons. So this is a significant reduction in CO2 emissions. As a reference point, I think in 2019, the ETS overall amounted to roughly 1.5 billion ton. So the CO2 emissions reduced here represent quite significant numbers. On the right, you see an important cost calculator. I mean, clearly reducing CO2 emissions comes with some additional costs. So let's have a look into them. Here we have plotted additional generation costs and their core elements. Again, of the 55% scenarios measured versus the 40% baseline. So this is the additional costs versus 40% cumulated from 2020 to 2030. And here we have plotted generation costs. So this includes all fixed variable costs that are directly related to generating power. Excludes some other elements like, for example, network and grid related costs. Costs are, as you can see, on the net level of 40 to 90 billion euro alongside the abated emissions roughly. This is the black cumulated line. I would say in the 55% policy mix scenario and in the 55 MCE scenario, the abatement costs are roughly on a similar level. In the market-based coal to clean scenario, the costs increase a bit more stark. But please note that in this cost calculation, since it's generation costs, we have also included the CO2 costs. And CO2 costs are naturally a bit higher if you have higher CO2 prices assumed in the scenarios. And it can be debated if you actually want to look at CO2 costs, additional CO2 costs as an indicator of economic efficiency of a scenario. If you look at average abatement cost relative to the CO2 emissions abated, we are in the range of 40 to 60 euro per ton. So one would say this is still rather cost efficient CO2 abatement happening here. Next to generation costs, which are an important indicator of economic efficiency from a system point of view, let's have a look into more distributional results, which reflect the costs of consumers. This slide shows the effects of the scenarios on the wholesale power price level in the different coal 6 countries and for our 355% scenarios. Again, we have plotted scenario differences. So this is additional, the price increase caused by moving to 55 from 40. In the 55% policy mix scenario, the prices increase in between 5 to 10 euro per megawatt hour on average over the time span 2021 to 2030. So this is 5 to 10. This represents the range of the different countries. In the market-based coal exit scenario, this range increases a bit to 7 to 13 euro per megawatt hour. Again, the range represents the different countries. And in the 55 market-based coal to clean scenario, the price ranges increase again a bit to 18 to 27 euro per megawatt hour. It's important to note that this is a combined effect of coal exit and also the assumed increase in ETS prices, right? So the ETS prices are actually a major driver of the visible increase in power prices. Maybe interesting to note the diminishing effect over time. Once the generation mix becomes a bit less carbon heavy, the effect on the wholesale prices reduces. And let's also put this into perspective. Is it a lot? Is it not? The recent surge in gas prices has caused wholesale base level to increase by beyond 50 euro per megawatt hour, depending on how you calculate it, depending on the countries and so on. So clearly, especially in the first two scenarios, the effect is not that heavy versus those strong fluctuations caused by other drivers we witness now. These effects in wholesale prices also reduce subsidies that need to be paid to renewable energy generators. So the overall cost to the consumer are generally a bit below. This slide shows the effect on power prices of consumers as measured again versus the 40% baseline for our three scenarios. In the 55% policy mix scenario on the left, the price effect is the lowest and averages €6 per megawatt hour, right? Over the time span 2021 to 2030 on average. In the 55% market-based coal exit, this increases to €8 per megawatt hour on average. And in the 55% market-based coal to clean, this increases to €18 per megawatt hour. Again, have a look at the diminishing effect over time, which also already kind of demonstrates that probably if we prolong this beyond 2030, the effects would decrease even further, because there's also less coal in the system, and there was less coal in the system in the 40% scenario. But clearly, the market-based coal to clean has a stronger effect on wholesale and consumer prices, because the ETS, which is in the driver's seat of the development here, causes a lot of distributional effects, because it's a very extensive, less, let's say, targeted mechanism versus policies like renewable energy expansion and versus policy like a regulated coal exit. Let's zoom in a bit into some details on reserve capacities. So to further assess the security supply effects of a specific energy policy mix in the scenarios, we calculated the potential need for strategic reserves that could be necessary to balance out a country. But let me comment a bit on that. What does that mean? A capacity balancing approach was applied here to calculate those strategic reserves, which reflected a potential need of national policymakers and regulators to ensure capacity roughly on peak load level. So this represents a case in which policymakers should decide, we want to serve our national peak load mostly independently by other countries, mostly on domestic level. This is kind of a security of supply related reserve. It's not something like what we see in many countries, like a grid reserve. To calculate the needs for a grid reserve, we would have need for other modeling approaches like grid modeling. So this slide shows the reserves need versus our baseline scenarios for all scenarios from left to right, as explained before, and aggregated for the coal 6 again. If you look at the numbers, maybe the bar first, we see an additional need of strategic reserves in the range of 3 to 6 gigawatt. So this would have to be deployed if peak loads should be met domestically mostly. And this could be recruited from different capacity sources. This could be newly built gas, or this could be decommissioned coal units, or, also innovative approaches could be applied, maybe storage, maybe additional demand side management. Maybe interesting to note also that the market-based coal to clean scenario has actually not the strongest, but in 2030 at least the lowest need for additional out of the market reserves, mostly because there is more gas and more renewables being deployed before 2030. So this crowds out partially, at least, because also wind onshore has a certain capacity effect, the need for additional reserves. So I think it's fair to say that the additional out-of-market deployment of reserves is relatively limited versus the developments we have seen on the overall capacity balance. Let me already sum up some main results from left to right. First, scenarios and CO2 prices, then capacity development, and then some info points when it comes to costs and prices. We modeled 4 different power market scenarios, one representing the baseline, the 40% scenario, and 3 different policy scenarios to reach a minus 55% target, or align the power market with such a target level. The modeling indicates that sustained prices in the ETS above 65 euro per ton, so this is more or less the level we have now, would be enough to phase out coal market-based in up until 2030, right? But again, this holds true on the gas prices. We assumed with the gas prices we have assumed before the recent developments. But of course, we're happy to discuss the effects that could be caused by the more recent developments in especially gas prices. And to reach a complete, to put the ETS in the driver's seat, so to make the ETS happen and drive the whole transition, phase out coal and finance renewables, our modeling comes up with roughly 150 euro per ton that would be needed. That's also roughly in line with what other studies have shown. This would allow the Coal 6 or the European Union to phase out most of the subsidies for renewable energies for most of the technologies. What does it mean in capacity developments? In our modeling, the phase out of the remaining 38 gigawatts of coal capacities in 2030 is met by 100 gigawatt or more of additional wind and PV. Across scenarios, this means an additional 11 to 24 gigawatts of gas capacities that need to be deployed with not very heavy utilization. It's mostly capacity. And across scenarios, an additional 3 to 6 gigawatt of strategic reserves if policymakers want to ensure peak load coverage, mostly domestically. This could be newly built units or could be decommissioned coal or other sources. Costs and prices. In our 55% scenarios, we see an increase in wholesale prices, especially if the ETS triggers development. Increases lie in between per country 5 to 10 euro per megawatt hour in the 55% policy mix scenario, 7 to 13 in the market-based coal exit, and 80 to 27 in the 55% market-based coal to clean scenario. Additional costs to the consumer versus the baseline remain limited in the range of 6 to 10 euro per megawatt hour. And maybe, if I may comment on it, if we assume higher gas prices than what we have assumed in our study, those effects would probably increase a bit, because by phasing out coal and switching more heavily to gas, if gas is a bit more expensive, this drives up those cost effects. But also please note that we mostly have a transition from coal to renewables, and all of those renewables are not depending on the gas prices, right? So as long as we ensure that we really have a full coal to clean transition, the effect of higher gas prices doesn't hit the consumer as much anymore. And to put these effects into perspective, given the recent price fluctuations we have seen, right, these are easily in the range of more than 50 euro per megawatt hour. So, well, I would say almost an order of magnitude higher than what we have modeled for our 55% scenarios. Thanks for your attention, and yeah, happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Julius. And let me just finish the slide presentation. Oops, actually, I think, Robin, you need to do that. Thank you very much. And maybe if we go back on gallery view, yes, we are. Thank you very much for this brain fill, I would say, and for introducing the 4 scenarios that you had a deeper look in. And I'm sure that people may want to have a look again into this, because there was a lot of information on the slides. And since we had one participant asking, if you have difficulties seeing graphs, you can, as participant, make there's a little vertical line between the presentation and the picture of the presenter. And you can draw that line a bit to the right in order to make the graph a bit more open. It's always a challenge to bring 4 different scenarios into one picture and still show all the different numbers. But of course, you can also have a look into the study, which you can find on our website. So, Julius, that were the line out, the drawing of the 4 scenarios. And now I wonder what the colleagues from Agora Energiewende, what kind of conclusions they drew from that. And therefore, I'd like to ask Christian Redl, my colleague, to pick up the microphone and enter the stage. Christian is also part of our EU team working from Bregenz, and he's a senior associate European Energy Corporation, heavily involved with market design and also with a strong focus on the Southeast Europe developments. And Christian, we're curious about the conclusions that Agora Energiewende draw from what Julius presented before. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Nicola. Good morning or good afternoon, where you're tuned in from, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure that I now can try to condense the plentiful data and scenario setup presented by Julius and what we take from it for a policy action plan to actually deliver then the coal phase out. Maybe before I start talking, let me quickly share my screen. And turn on the presentation mode. Okay, it should work now, I hope.
It does.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. So first of all, let me maybe take a step back. Why the focus then on the power sector and why the coal phase out in the power sector is so important? Well, it basically boils down to the medium-term and long-term decarbonization targets of the European Union. As you know, and we've also heard from Michaela, Europe recently stepped up its commitment to tackle the climate crisis, to achieve net zero emissions in Europe by latest 2050, and to decrease, of course, emissions by 55% by 2030. Now, when we look into the sectoral breakdown of which sector has to deliver which emission reductions, we see that specifically for the 2030 perspective, the power sector stems almost half of the required overall emission reduction. Why is that? There are the lowest cost decarbonization options available. We have onshore wind and solar PV essentially being cost competitive, and we still have, let's say, very polluting and carbon intensive coal in the mix. So in the short-term perspective, then the power sector can deliver deep emission reductions. Also in the longer term, the power sector is of course important, and Michaela referred to the IEA's recommendation to achieve net zero power systems by 2035 in advanced economies, because we will on the road to net zero use more electricity, clean electricity, also in the other sectors. So to decarbonize transport, electric mobility, to decarbonize the heating sector, heat pumps, for example, similar also for heat provision in the industry sector, we will more and more rely on green electricity to decarbonize these other sectors. So that's why also here in the longer term, beyond 2030, the power sector is the sector that reaches net zero first. Now, coming back to the 2030 perspective, to deliver the emission reductions in the power sector, the coal phase out is essentially a requirement. Julius has already mentioned we need to mainly shift to renewables. So it also has implications for fossil gas, which I will also pick up later on. Now, when we look at the map, we see that 21 European Union member states have already committed and decided to phase out coal, both hard coal and lignite, in their power systems by 2030. And then there is the what we've called the coal six, and Julius talked about them. So Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, and Romania and Slovenia. Those have either set the coal phase out date past 2030, are currently discussing, but with a view also after 2030, or have not, let's say, formally started a discussion. So it's really then that the modeling focuses on these 6 countries, and also essentially the policy recommendations are relevant then for these countries. And with what we take from the scenario modeling in terms of what's a useful, let's say, an effective mix of policy instruments, we have clustered it as shown in this slide. We think that the policy mix that consists of interrelated both national and EU level elements to, on the one hand, phase out coal and replace it by renewables, ensure security of supply. And then the third pillar, of course, this transition has to happen in a just manner. So these are the 3 main elements. For all 3 pillars, we have clustered several policy instruments, which I will not dive into too much detail. I'd just want to give you, let's say, an understanding how our thinking on this is, to put things in perspective. Then, of course, you're more than happy to look into the study and the paper, and we hope you find it also interesting. Now, quickly, the 3 pillars. The first pillar, replacing coal with renewables. As said, we need to phase out coal to meet the emission reduction that is needed to deliver the 55% target by 2030. And we need to replace, of course, the ever lowering generation of coal with something else. And again, from emissions perspective, this has essentially to be done with renewables. And because of the cost competitiveness, it's mainly solar PV and wind energy then replacing outgoing hard coal and lignite. And now this figure shows a little bit similar to what Julius has shown now, but just focusing on this power policy mix scenario, the power mix in 2030. We see some 2/3 of renewables in the generation mix. Overall, 50% of the power generation will come from wind and PV because of cost reasons. And then the remaining, let's say 1/3 non-renewables, is half nuclear and half gas. Compared to the current gas generation, this also means that 15% lower gas is being generated in power plants in Europe at 2030. Now, how to get to these 2/3 renewables, and then, of course, after 2030, ever increasing share of renewables. Here again, the policy mix comes into play. Julius mentioned in detail the effects of the carbon pricing. So, of course, a reformed ETS is of utmost importance. It increases the efficiency of the system. At the same time, the ETS cannot do the job alone. We have heard that for the coal exit alone, we would need at least sustained prices of 65 euros per ton to get coal out of the system, but that would not then do, let's say, the market job to fully replace it with renewables. As a side remark, countries who are discussing the coal exit to, let's say, hedge against maybe some volatility in the ETS, here also national carbon floor prices can be of help. And if we then flag this or mirror this with our modeling, then those floor prices should at least be 65 euros per ton. Now, instruments to enable the refinancing of renewables. So I wouldn't call it subsidies, because from, let's say, a system cost perspective, they are the cost-efficient technologies, wind and PV, but they have specific features. They are capital cost intensive. Yeah? They have essentially zero running costs. but let's say essentially fully investment cost intensive. And then when you have a power market and a lot of renewables, then you have this infamous merit order effect, such that wholesale prices are low because the renewables bid in with essentially zero bids, and this lowers or depresses then the wholesale price level. So we need another instrument to refinance the renewables. It's not that they are expensive, it's just they have different, let's say, economic characters. And that's why I like to call this more revenue stabilization mechanisms, maybe a bit more a complex word, but I think that captures what these instruments should do. And they, of course, need to be allowed through EU state aid regulation. So this is one element. Technology specific auctions are a cost-efficient instrument, and that needs to be allowed from the European framework, of course. For the country level perspective, countries need to start updating the national energy and climate plans. So the targets need to be increased in those plans, but then concretely in terms of policy instruments on the domestic level, that also means we need higher auction volumes, and very importantly also in several countries, planning and permitting is still an issue, so lowering the administrative burden to get renewables connected to the grid is also something where I think member states can learn from each other and apply best practices. And the third element I would also want to mention here to help and support the deployment of renewables. I said the policy mix, it's quite interrelated, is also power market design. Yeah, we need ever more flexible power markets. I've called it here faster and larger, to ease the integration of renewables, specifically variable renewables, onshore wind in that case. It helps the operators of the plant if they can market their electricity on short-term intraday markets with short gate closure times. This lowers, then they can adjust, let's say, their offers to the market depending on the most recent weather forecast. This lowers then again the imbalance costs, lowers the cost of capital, lowers the risks, lowers the system costs. So market design, specifically making the markets more flexible, is key. There was, I think, already one comment in the chat on heating. Of course, in these countries, coal plants are also used to supply heat for district grids. So also there, it's important when you phase out the coal CHP, you need to replace it by a mix of energy efficiency, large-scale heat pumps, solar thermal, geothermal, to a certain extent, probably also fossil gas, but there then also the hydrogen readiness is an important aspect. So also there, to have the provisions that also renewables can further penetrate the heating market. So much for pillar one. Pillar two, ensuring security of supply. To make it very simple, well, we need a mix of different flexibility options on the supply side, on the demand side, the grids, cross-border system integration. These are the key elements on, let's say, more of a meta level for ensuring security of supply. Why is that? Because when we move into this world of, let's say, wind and solar dominated power system, yeah, flexibility is the key parameter to ensure that the system runs stable. So along the road to net zero, safeguarding system security actually is not so much about this maybe traditional thinking, how much capacity do we have installed in our power systems, but rather what kind of capacity. So is it capable to ramp up and down, to react flexible, to mirror wind and PV generation. Of course, this has then still important implications for the generation side. So the scenarios, as Julius mentioned, imply some additional gas investments around about 15 gigawatts, but again with lower generation compared to today. We need stronger grids because the cross-border system integration is actually one of the most efficient enablers of security of supply, because we can benefit from different weather patterns. So as a rule of thumb, you can say maybe if the wind is ramping up in Northwest Europe, it's quite likely that it's ramping down in Southeast Europe. So on average, there is no change in the generation of wind. And as you can see in this graph, which shows for a week in 2030, the hourly wind feed-in, the blue line for Romania. Here you can see quite high fluctuations, up to 50% of installed capacity. Then the pinkish line, the entire region of Southeast Europe, where already the curve is flatter, because also amongst neighboring countries, one sees quite some smoothing effects. And then even if you look at the European level, the green line, you see it's much more stable. That also means we need much less, let's say, flexibility options to compensate for this changing wind output. So cross-border system integration, absolutely important. The demand side needs to be incentivized to participate. And here again, the market design is important, so that the price signals are really there also for the demand side to become active. And that's then, I think, the first main ingredient. If national resource adequacy concerns emerge, then we need more refined short-term markets to get a better pricing, scarcity pricing. There are some quite relevant developments in certain markets to improve, let's say, the predictability of scarcity prices, and also decrease then the risks for investors, both on the demand and supply side. Strategic reserves that fully operate outside the energy markets can also be a cost-efficient instrument to back up. And then only if, I'd say, these two steps would not be enough, then policymakers in our thinking should only start then considering introducing capacity instruments. Okay, and then already the last slide, the third pillar, enabling a just coal phase out. Well, of course, phasing out coal, it is a profound challenge. It has happened slowly over the last years, and in this sense, the energy transition is accelerating developments, and that means then, of course, we need a quicker action. Here, the EU environment already foresees quite some financing instruments that can help, but there's also still quite some unallocated funding, be it under the recovery and resilience facility, but also in the more, let's say, general EU budget, the structural and cohesion funding, which can still be used to support this transition. And then moving into the countries, of course, we need, let's say that this is a shared vision across all layers of the country, of the regions, the stakeholder groups, and to jointly develop these just transition concepts for the coal regions. Again, state aid is also on the, let's say, on the coal side of things, of the coal to clean switch, important. There are in the draft stated guidelines which should apply as of next year already provisions that state aid can also be, or let's say, payments to coal regions and phasing out coal can be considered state aid, and that would be okay, subject to the guidelines. But here it's important that it's really only then targeting accelerated, so additional efforts to really early phase out coal. And then Julius already mentioned this important aspect of increasing power prices for the, so there's also, of course, a consumer dimension that needs to be just. And here indeed we see that the additional consumer costs for the coal phase out scenarios are quite limited, 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour on average. Some countries even benefit in terms of wholesale price developments compared to the status quo. So there are some additional costs. I'd say again, to highlight, it's a magnitude lower than what we see currently due to the high gas prices. But here there are also instruments and also the reform of how electricity prices are structured, how surcharges, taxes, obliges and levis let's say, distributed over the different energy carriers, can enable to essentially lower or eliminate the burden and shift it away from ever greener electricity to fossil fuels, and also then take care of the consumer effect. With this, I'd like to stop and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for introducing us to the conclusions that you draw from the modeling of the scenarios that Julius presented to us before. And again, to the audience, if you're interested in the full study, have a look on our website. You find both parts there as a full study. It's not that big. It's just some 30 or so pages. And also, obviously, you'll find the presentations on our website. And we did hear that a policy mix on both levels, EU level as well as member states level, is necessary. And lucky us, I believe we have representatives from both on our panel. And for the moderation of the panel discussion, which will take part for the last hour of this webinar, I will ask my colleague Alexander Dusold to enter the podium first. Hello, Alexander. Alexander is also a member of our EU team working from Brussels. He is also Senior Associate European Energy Cooperation. This is such a long title, and I always sort of get knots in my tongue. His focus is on energy policy, market design also, and integration of renewables. And with this, I hand over to you, and I'm curious about the upcoming discussion.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and hello, everyone. Thanks to the presenters, to Julius and Christian, for this exciting insights into our modeling and Agora's action plan. And thanks to the audience for maintaining stable in the meeting. So that's very nice to see. And I hope we can still interest you with the exciting panel coming up now. And also thanks a lot for the questions that you have been raising in the Q&A. Many of those have been answered already by the colleagues, but yeah, I will keep some of those also for the discussion with the panelists later on. So the next hour, basically, we will have a first round with the panelists, followed by 15 minutes Q&A. So please, if you have questions directly to the panelists, please don't hesitate to also put them in the Q&A, and then we will address them in those 15 minutes. And we'll conclude with a second round with the panelists. Yeah, so I'd like to introduce the panel. We are starting with Francesco Ferrioli, who's a policy officer at the European Commission and a modeling expert of the European energy system. Welcome, Francesco. We have
Hi, nice inviting me.
We have Radostina Primova, and she's a senior analyst in the economic program of our Bulgarian think tank partner, the Center for the Study of Democracy. Welcome, Radostina.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join the debate today.
We have Radu Dudau, who's a director at the Energy Policy Group, our think tank partner in Romania.
Hi, good to be with you today. Thank you.
Hello. We have Jiří Koselau, who is the campaigns director at Friends of the Earth in the Czech Republic, and as far as I know, has been member of the Czech Coal Commission. Welcome, Jiří.
Hello, thank you for invitation. It's a pleasure for me.
We can't see you yet. Yeah, perfect. Hello. Then we have, for the German perspective, we have our colleague Philipp Litz, who's a senior associate at Agora Energiewende. He's an expert for the coal phase out in Germany and a general energy policy expert.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Philipp. Finally, we have Professor Dimitri Lalas, who's a senior advisor at Facets and former president of the National Observatory of Athens. That's our think tank partner in Greece. Welcome, Dimitri. I think I've seen you already.
Right. Good morning. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Very interesting results have been presented already to give food for discussion.
Perfect. So the panel is complete. Yeah, so for the first round in the panel, again, I would like to start with the European Commission and Francesco's and the Commission's perspective on the future of coal in the European power system and what this building block means for a net zero power system and a decarbonized economy by 2050. Afterwards, we're going to go to the 5 member states that we have on the panel and get an update on the state of national discussions on the coal phase out and the relation to our Agora's proposed policy action plan. So 4 of these member states are actually of the coal 6, and we have Dimitri from Greece to share his experience. But yes, I would like to start with Francesco from the European Commission and then go through the panel. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, we do agree here at the Commission at the GNR that the coal phase out is one of the most important measures to be taken in Europe and especially worldwide, where globally there is a very young fleet of newly installed coal-fired power plant, which will have to be dealt with. I can share with you some quick insight from our modeling exercises. I'm on the modeling team, and we carry around an analysis which is fairly close to what presented, but I can share you what we found and mainly the common point that we see with your analysis. We don't have in our projection a complete coal phase out by 2030, but nearly. We have minus 75% use of coal by 2030, which is even higher in power generation, where it is a bit easier to substitute. So it's minus 80% in power generation. But by 2040, the phase out is almost complete. So if it doesn't happen by 2030, it will happen very soon after that. We see indeed that the installed capacity decrease a bit slower than the generation, meaning that coal-fired power plants are used as reserve. This is always an attractive option when you have aging fleet of coal-fired power plant like in Europe. And we do see that the impact will be especially high for some countries and some regions. These are regions which have mining activities, which also tend to be the same, that still don't have a coal phase out for obvious economic region. So this will call for EU solidarity. But we see also that with those very high carbon prices, the carbon revenues should be sufficient to compensate at least the most affected citizens in some regions or in some income classes. And also we should keep in mind that the coal jobs, they started decreasing in Europe largely before the climate policies, as early as the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So we could not assume that those coal jobs will be around forever simply because of exhaustion of a depletion of natural resources. So the question is, would this coal phase out and the energy transition in general be sustainable? Our results on cost are similar to yours. We see an impact on electricity prices only with very high scenarios that are very high carbon prices, and we don't have scenarios which has as high carbon price as you have. Otherwise, the increasing cost would be rather moderate. However, it is true investment will be crucial, and we see also today where we have there are bottlenecks also in this global supply of natural gas, because also production of fossil fuels needs investment to become online. And if you're not investing in fossil fuel, if you're phasing out fossil fuels, then we need to mobilize investment in renewables at the right scale to avoid roadblocks like we are facing, or an increasing market price and response from the market. So this is, in a nutshell, everything that I would like to say. As I said, we largely had the same results that you found in your study.
Thank you very much, Francesco. May I have one follow-up question? You already mentioned the rising, or we talked before about the rising gas prices, rising electricity prices. So what's from the Commission's perspective, what's your take on these currently high electricity prices? Do you think that the recently published toolbox helps to mitigate sufficiently or gives the member states enough tools to deal with the rising costs? Or in how far do you think this high prices affect also the coal phase out and delay it potentially?
Well, the toolbox is a start. It depends what we see in the winter and also on how cold the winter will be. We are conducting further analysis to monitor the situation. Indeed, there is a kind of a perfect storm. We have an extremely strong economic recovery coupled with low investment on the upstream globally, because also of many reasons, also the fact that investors are moving away from fossil fuels and have been for a few years. So this is indeed not an issue which is directly connected to the energy transition, and in particular the energy transition in Europe. But it's true that a very high ETS price makes this, normally the market would react switching from gas to coal. Now, even coal prices are increasing, but due to the technical characteristic of coal, this is less, the increase in prices would be limited. You have, more capital cost and less variable cost in coal. So this is not possible, this switch now that with very high ETS price. So this creates a kind of a pinch. This is a normal reaction of the market where price increases. So what does it mean? We think that this should be a temporary increase. We don't see any structural issue for this to continue apart, a very strong economic expansion. At some point, either where LNG will become available and or renewable will come online, but we need to make sure that the right investment, the incentive for investment are in place to avoid that, to make sure that this is over as fast as possible. Now, this will require certainly more work than just the toolbox, more work on the taxonomy, more work on the projection on our side, and more work from member states to monitor the situation on the ground and to plan measures.
Thank you very much. This is a lot of information and very insightful. Thanks a lot, Francesco. Let's continue in the panel. Radostina, let's get an update on Bulgaria in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, well, in Bulgaria, we had a lot of developments in the past 2 weeks. First of all, for the first time, basically with the new 5th version of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, the government announced 2 indicative deadlines for a coal phase-out. Before we didn't have, and still we don't have a comprehensive coal phase-out strategy, but for the first time, it announced 2038 and 2040 as possible deadlines for the coal phase-out in Bulgaria under strong pressure of the coal miners that organized a protest in Sofia last week. Of course, this is not in line currently with the EU schedule and particularly for the intermediate 2030 targets. And we also have to take into consideration also the political situation in Bulgaria, because the 5th version of the recovery plan basically was submitted by the interim government. There will be now in November the 3rd parliamentary elections this year. So this basically we're still expecting. The current interim government is hesitant to take a major decision on these quite sensitive issues, also amidst pressure of trade unions. One important thing to mention is how the government is proceeding so far. We have already taken part in a project, Green Recovery, where we evaluated this kind of long-term decarbonization effort and also the decarbonization efforts within the recovery and resilience plan is the government is planning to replace coal capacity first with 1 gigawatt of gas-fired power plants. So there is a very strong focus in the midterm decarbonization strategy on gas that will perpetuate the dependence on Russia and Gazprom as gas supplies will increase, and also on prices. And according to us, any investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure is also a step in the wrong direction, as it would increase. First of all, it could lead to long-term lock-in gas infrastructure, and second, also the government is also planning to expand the natural gas transmission infrastructure, and this could also lead to a long-term lock-in. Although the government is saying that between 2029 and 2035, there could be temporarily switch to hydrogen from 30 to 100%. Still, most of this hydrogen will come from gas. So basically, we have developed decarbonization scenarios in which basically we say that if there is a hydrogen, it has to be green hydrogen coming from wind and solar. A second thing in the plan is already the government is planning to expand also the renewable energies investment with 1.7 gigawatt of new investments in renewable energies. However, the conditions in the public tenders are designed in such a way that basically they will profit only utility scale projects and not small and medium enterprise, because there is an additional condition that of 25 ensuring 20 storage. That means that the electricity produced needs to provide also 25% of storage, basically, which would create a discriminatory barrier for basically small scale producers of renewable energy, and could strengthen also oligopolistic, the current oligopolistic structures on the energy markets that we observe that only these big players could access these financial resources of the Just Transition Plan, and could basically have even a counterproductive effect on the economic diversification. As we know, one of the major goals currently of the Just Transition mechanism, which is the major mechanism for the coal phase-out, is not only to achieve decarbonization, but also this kind of green transformation potential. That means diversification. There is a strong focus on small and medium enterprises, on energy communities, on diversification, and we don't see this approach towards diversification of the sustainable alternatives and citizen-led projects, but rather reinforcing of the current market structures in the sectors. So currently, the Bulgarian plan is not supportive. They're looking for a way to extend to a maximum because of socio-economic concerns and because of pressure of the trade unions and miners, the deadline until 2040. That was the last thing announced basically on Friday. We had also in Sofia a conference with Timmermans, who came to Sofia, but he didn't comment whether this 2040 deadline would be acceptable for the Commission. So in previous negotiations on the Bulgarian Recovery and Resilience Plan, the Commission mentioned as a condition a coal phase-out deadline, and also this requirement of compensating the coal phase-out with at least 1.7 gigawatt of renewables, that, however, we learn basically are not and particularly in line fully with EU competition rules.
Thanks a lot, Radostina. In respect of time, I will just continue with the panel and hand the microphone to Radu, giving a view on the Romanian situation.
Yes, thank you very much for having me today, and congratulations in the first place to Agora Energiewende and the colleagues who did this very interesting modeling. The results are really interesting and worthwhile, an in-depth discussion. On our side in Romania, just as in Bulgaria's case, a deadline for coal phase-out was forced out of the energy ministry. 2032 was announced in the recovery and resilience plan. But then the energy minister was quick to explain for the domestic audience that the deadline is not really a coal phase out, it's just about hard coal, not about lignite, which makes up about 90% of, well, coal consumptions in the country. So this is the real elephant in the room, lignite. So we think that the issue is still ambiguous in terms of government, of the government's commitment to a deadline. And anyway, we're not having a plan for it, an orderly, strategic phase out, which will make matters only more complicated. With our colleagues from Sofia and Athens, and also with the partners from REC in Budapest and Technical University in Vienna, we calculated a couple of years back in a study dedicated to coal phase out in Southeast Europe that for Romania, 2026 already was a feasible deadline at an assumed ETS price of only 30 euros per ton, with the assumption that the planned capacity for new gas power plants were to come to fruition, and we were talking about 1.6 gigawatt worth of such new gas power plants, as put forth by the government itself, and the restructuring plan for the national lignite company called Complexul Energetic Oltenia. Oltenia is the lignite region of the country. Now, this particular plan is still under approval at the European Commission. We doubt that it can be approved as such, but suffice it to say that it relies importantly on new gas capacities, and there are also investments foreseen in renewables, especially solar PV, which makes sense considering that the region has above country average PV potential. And on this note, we at EPG did and published, launched last month, a study regarding the green economic development of the Gorj County, which is the main lignite basin of the country. And we delineated clear lines of economic development for the region in terms of renewables, in terms of energy efficiency in buildings, and also battery storage capacities. These are lines of development that the local community, that the local authorities support a great deal as well. And we think the region could capitalize massively on a couple of things that other parts of the country cannot offer in terms of massive available sources of EU funds, very favorable state aid rules that apply there. So there's a lot that region could do to turn green and from a laggard of sorts in terms of the energy transition, become really a role model for what this transition could be about. I see that I'm probably done up with my time. I'll stop here, and if there is anything else, I'll get back to it later. Yeah,
it's great to hear, and interesting thinking on the regional approach. Yeah, time is running, so we really have 3 minutes per panelist now. Jiří, you would be the next on the panel. How is it in the Czech Republic?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to continue with the Czech perspective now. Now we have several independent economic modeling and great simulations with the result that lignite and coal-free electricity and heating system in Czech Republic in 2030 is possible, and the main solution is the renewable energy sources development. And the first lignite and hard coal power plants or blocks were shut down last year. Next this year, and some others are announced. And production from other power plants is declining, as well as export of electricity from Czech Republic. We exported 13 terawatt hours in 2019, 10 terawatt hours in 2020, and this year it can be less than 8 terawatt hours, but we will see the effect of recent gas prices, but trend is clear. What we need is a plan for coal, and it means mainly lignite in Czech Republic phase out, but we haven't it yet. We have no plan. We had the coal commission in Czech Republic, or we have still have a coal commission, but no solid results and so on. And widely held view among politicians in Czech Republic is that we will turn off coal power plants when we do not need them. And many politicians associate the end of coal with the launch of the new nuclear reactor in Czech Republic. We have now 6 reactors and a plan for the new one. But optimistic term for new nuclear reactor in Czech Republic with around 9 terawatt hours of electricity per year is 2040. But we need to replace about 20 terawatt hours from lignite and coal, which is generation without exports in 2030 at the latest. So it's a big gap, and our all state strategic documents in Czech Republic are horribly old and counts with the coal and lignite after 2050. So we have nothing. This strategic documents are old and for nothing. So now we have. We had a general election in Czech Republic 10 days ago, and the new government from former opposition parties being formed now. But there is a great risk that even the new government will not say anything specific about coal and about coal phase out, only that the coal is declining, but it's fact, it's not a plan. So, and we can't wait for the new state energy policy, which will be prepared for about 3 years. We need a strong signal from the government now, from the starting government now, and then we need the emergency scenario for the rapid coal phase out. This is from my perspective, the situation in Czech Republic. We have studies, we have modelings, we have simulations, but we need a strong plan and strong signal from government. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks a lot, Jiří. Very exciting too. Philip, can you present on the German situation shortly?
Yes, absolutely. Where are we coming from in Germany? As you might know, Germany has recently decided on a coal phase out. The background for that was the implementation of a stakeholder commission. And the result of the stakeholder commission, the coal commission, was a mandated phase out plan for coal, including compensations for the utilities, a coal to clean approach, and a strong just transition policies in terms of supporting the regions as well as the workers for the phase out. So in general, there's already a quite substantial set of policies in place to manage the phase out. Nonetheless, the big problem was actually that the phase out was stretched until 2038. It was already quite late when it was decided on, but even more now due to the recent development in the last year, which is first the implementation of the Green Deal, where we already heard now from the colleague of the European Commission that this is only achievable at the near coal phase out until 2030 on the European level. And secondly, there was also the more ambitious climate targets that the German government implemented after a High Court ruling in June this year, which reflects climate neutrality until 2045 and higher climate targets until 2030 of -65%, which also technically implies the energy sector to phase out of coal until 2030 to meet those targets. So this is the current setting. And now we're having a new government, not yet in place, but we recently had parliament elections. And what we're seeing at the moment are negotiations between the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Liberals, which would follow up a so-called grand coalition of conservative and social democrats before. And they're currently negotiating the coalition treaty and have already published a first draft paper of the first previous results, preliminary results, sorry, which includes the goal that coal phase out should be accomplished until 2030, if possible. So coal phase out until 2030, if possible, plus the amendment of all the just transition social measures. What this exactly means, we will see in the next couple of weeks, but nonetheless, maybe one last sentence, the most important part probably in that is not only the political goal of saying we want to reach coal phase out under 2030, but especially the biggest difficulties that the German energy transition in the power sector currently has is the increase of renewable energy, which means getting forward in not so much on the PV side, but especially on the wind onshore side, which would mean increasing the existing targets and the funding, speed up permitting processes, provide the actual space for the windmills. This is, in my understanding, the most crucial part to actually make this coal to clean transition happening in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Philip. And let's move on with Dimitri on the Greek situation.
Thank you, Alexander. Okay, I guess Greece is the one that has the smiling face from the emoji collection as far as decarbonization is concerned in the energy sector. As you know, in 2019, we announced that we will be closing down all the lignite power plants by 2028. In the meantime, that target was down to all the power plants except the one closed 2008. We seem to be on schedule on that. And as a matter of fact, the last that would have been operating because it's brand new until 2028, and now has to close down by switch in 2025 from lignite to natural gas with increased capacity. It will go from 600 megawatts to about 1,000 megawatts natural gas. Now, in the meantime, there has been movement in the natural gas construction phase, and another power plant of 800 megawatts is now currently under construction to be finished, to be finalized soon, and two and possibly three more, also 800 megawatt apiece, are in planning stages. They are fully permitted, and they are trying to decide whether they're going to go ahead or not. So that part of the situation looks pretty good, except, and in addition, let me also mention that the just transition part is also going very well. The mechanism to support the lignite regions is in place. Plans and some detailed plans have already been worked out with some problems, but anyway, that particular part of the delignitization is also going ahead in pretty good shape. Now, the worry has arisen lately because of the extreme events of last summer, the heat waves in late July, early August, brought up again the question of stability of the system and reserves. The lignite plants were, which were basically working with a capacity factor of 20%, around 15%, started operating again with more hours. And that was used as an argument why they should continue to operate longer than the schedule right now. So that is something to worry about. That possibly is based on the desire of the Greek government to provide some capacity compensation to Public Power Corporation, which is the one that is the owner of all big lignite plants, as partial compensation for closing them down. Now, PPC, the Public Corporation, is owned 51% by the Greek government. And lately it was announced that the Greek government will sell 17%. So it'll be a minority holder. But the question is whether they're going to hold the management or not. And that is a part of an internal debate, a political debate as well. And we'll see how that goes. Mind you, the situation in Greece, as Radostina also mentioned, is oligopolistic anyway, because what's going on is that eventually there are 4 big conglomerates that basically take care of all production in Greece. All of them are now being having capacity in renewables as well as natural gas, and they're also providing retail sales to customers. So which brings up the question of how the system will operate in Greece. I heard Christian say that the response time and intraday trading should be speeded up, which is correct in theory, but it's a question of whether in an oligopolistic environment, whether you need to have some basic rules reinforced a little bit more strongly by the overseeing organization, which is the agency, the regulatory agency for energy. And that is something that I think that we should look at a little bit more carefully, and especially in a time where the perfect storm that was mentioned before is here. Mind you, the decision of the Greek government in 2019 is proof of the strength of the ETS effectiveness, and I think that needs also to be strengthened so that indeed it provides the benefit, the power to make sure that the lignitization goes smoothly, with the proviso that also was mentioned that some of the proceeds from the increased price, would go to compensate customers so for the increase in the wholesale price that will appear. The modeling included the cost for the allowance in the pricing. So that needs now to be basically subtracted to make sure that that society does not react negatively and provide negative feedbacks to this process. But in any case, I'm probably the only one here that says, well, we're doing well, and hopefully we'll continue to do well.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Also very exciting. And I would love to have more time talking to you, all of you. So maybe in future we have a physical meeting again and can extend after the meeting a bit. For now, I would love to go to the Q&A session, as we especially during the presentations in the beginning, got a couple of questions that are definitely worth sharing. So most of them should be answered already directly in the Q&A, but I'd like to share some of them with you and hear the response. It's mainly to Julius from Enervis and Christian from Agora. First of all, there was a question from John Baldwin on the 11 to 25 gigawatt of additional gas generation needed. First question, is it unabated? Question, what load factor do you model for this gas backup? And assumption, if the load factor is more than 5% or something, so quite small, then it's maybe not a major cause of greenhouse gas emissions, and would not be a problem to switch.
I mean,
not sure. Yeah,
happy to say a few points on that. In our modeling, this is unabated, but this raises the questions: how do we align this with long-term climate neutrality targets, right? And our fallback option in regards to that is not abatement; it's mostly switch to hydrogen. In our modeling so far, whenever we look at carbon neutrality scenarios, mostly hydrogen wins out against abatement. So the plants being commissioned ought to be hydrogen ready so that they can later switch to hydrogen. And regarding the utilization, I mean, if they are ready to be switched to hydrogen, and this is a big if, we provide the necessary hydrogen supply at some point further out, mostly after 2030, then a bit of an increase in utilization is not super, a bit of a utilization not super complicated, not much of an issue, as long as it adds to security of supply and cost efficiency of the system. So we still have a load factor of 1,500 maybe full load hours of those gas plants on average.
Thanks a lot, Julius. We get another question from Johnny West, a bit complicated on the finances. So he says, prices are lower across the board with the policy mix scenario. But is that because this scenario also involves significant public subsidy to the renewables expansion, and therefore great pressure on public finances, which in turn would likely be met in the end by raising taxes or cutting services? So that would need to include these to get a total system view. So the question, if the policy mix scenario does not take into account the money spent on subsidies.
Should I maybe start, and then maybe Julius or Rita, you can complement with some more concrete numbers?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think in general, the answer would be no, in very short. On average, we see across the 55% scenarios, especially with the policy mix, that's our recommended one, on average over the decade, additional consumer cost of the 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And there, Julius has shown that the breakdown of the additional generation costs amongst the main components, renewables cost, CO2 costs, etc. But to make a long story short, it's not, let's say, only then additional costs from renewables, because we have much more renewables in the system, but on average, let's say the additional support needs decrease because, first of all, we expect further cost digression. And we also see, let's say, higher CO2 costs where renewables also can benefit a bit. But before I hand over to the Enervis experts, maybe on adding some numbers or some additional facts, I again would like to take a step back and emphasize, let's say, this issue of, we have the capex intensive wind and PV plants, and when they produce, typically they produce in times when there's a lot of wind and or PV, so wholesale market prices are low, so they cannot benefit from the price spikes like a dispatchable gas plant or coal plant. So in times of scarcity, it means there's little renewables and high market prices, but then the renewables can only partially benefit from that. So for the full market-based deployment, we would need this 150 euros per ton CO2, which would raise wholesale prices
quite massively. But still it's needed to fully refinance the renewables from the market. And I think there, Julius mentioned a very important number, namely on average, our abatement costs are in the range of 40 to 60, so lower than the current ETS price, which means renewables, wind PV, they are, from a system perspective, the cost competitive, cheapest abatement option, but due to their ratio of CAPEX versus OPEX, they cannot benefit from high prices. And that makes it a bit tricky, and that's why we need these additional revenue stabilization mechanisms. That's what I wanted to say from a policy perspective. Julius and Rita, please add.
Yeah, I'm happy to add some facts maybe on the cost components that we differentiate because of, this complex situation. And first of all, I mean, as Christian said, that's the reason why we look at the system costs as a whole. And of course, the cost for renewables, which are CAPEX intensive, are included in these and are therefore accounted for in the scenario comparison. And then when it comes to the perspective of consumers and who actually bears the cost of this system change, we decided to look at two factors, one of it, which is the wholesale volumes, which are basically a result of the wholesale-based prices, where for one, of course, we have the effect of the overall level, which is in these scenarios at least very strongly impacted by the CO2 price trajectories. And of course, in this case, the higher the CO2 price, the higher the wholesale price. And of course, to some extent, also the higher the revenues for renewables, so the market-based revenue for renewables is higher in the scenarios with higher CO2 prices and higher wholesale prices. But as Christian also said, only to a limited degree because of the very nature of renewables and the resulting cannibalization effect. The higher the penetration of the renewables, the higher is the effect of the cannibalization, and thus the lower or the less they benefit from actual rising wholesale power prices. And the second component of the consumer costs that we looked at are then the remaining, so to say, gap of RES costs that would have to be filled by the part or the part that's not filled by wholesale revenues from the renewables. And that pretty much, I mean, not one-on-one, but that is a mirroring picture, so to say. So you would need, because of the cannibalization effect, pretty high and increasingly high, so to say, wholesale power price levels to fully market-based refinance them. And you would, on the other hand, need significantly less additional, whatever you may call it, you don't want to call it subsidies, but additional financing to cover the full cost of the renewables. And so the decision or the question is merely like on which side of that mirror do you assume the policy trajectory to be? So do you assume it to be on a more, let's say, volatile and risky side of the wholesale market and wholesale market revenues, where we actually have an adverse effect of not financing renewables solely based on that, the higher the share of their renewables is, or you decide to go for a more governed and planned refinancing measure, which is via, of course, then somehow policy-based instruments, and these, of course, would have to be financed or back-financed from somewhere else. But actually, from a system perspective, and also from a perspective of governing the cost and the distribution of the cost, it might be a more feasible way to go.
Thanks a lot, Rita, for these explanations. Time is running. Let's do the last question, 1 minute maximum. From Daniel Hambrock, could you elaborate on the risk of grid stability you see in rising renewables, or precisely how huge do you evaluate the risk of an unstable grid or even blackouts?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that up. what causes grid instability and the risk of blackout is maybe the first question, right? We classically see three elements in there. The first is not being able to serve peak load in a way, and this is the capacity element. The second is we need to be able to cover the gradients of the system. This is mostly balancing energy related. And the third is having instability in the grid in the sense that the regional disbalance in the grid. And the quick answer is the first two of them, right? Providing capacity and providing flexibility. That is a solvable issue. We know how to solve it, basically. Gas plays an important role. Storage plays an important role. We just need to kind of scale up the solutions we have, and we need to put some money in there to make it happen. The third needs grid expansion and grid intelligence, right? That is, as we know, a bit more of a fickle question. It can be solved, but it's a bit more complicated to scale up the solutions we have. But even if we should not perform on grid expansion as we in our models would foresee, the good news is probably we're not talking risk or blackout. Blackout is something that's probably not going to happen much anymore. Theoretically, the most risky point would be a brownout or something like that, so which is much smaller in scale. But we mostly would foresee that it's a bit more difficult to integrate renewables, so some more curtailment than we would like to see. So we don't really see that the third point as much as a risk to security of supply. We see it more as a risk to renewable integration.
Thanks, Julius. Time is running. Anyhow, I would like to have a quick second round with the full panel. And yeah, we have 4 minutes. Therefore, I would just like each of you to say like in 2 words, maximum 2 sentences, but rather 2 words on what has to happen after the coal exit for meeting the 2050 decarbonization targets. So what do you think are the 2 most relevant topics that have to happen in your country after the coal exit? And I hope the question is clear. We would start with Francesco.
Yes, I think we will need new technology for those sectors that are to decarbonize, not necessarily the power sector.
Perfect. Radostina.
I would say an immediate coal phase out, long-term decarbonization strategy, also based on electrification of the energy transport building sectors, also investments in particularly in innovative technology, like using the offshore wind capacity in the Black Sea region that has not been uptaken in government documents. Finally, I would like to say that the Center for the Study of Democracy has developed also a benchmarking comparative framework for evaluation of the territorial just transition plans in Central and Eastern Europe that we currently published, and we would like to use it as a tool for evaluating the territorial just transition plans in the regions. I will send the link.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Radu, over to you.
Well, for Romania, to the point, 2 things: a coal phase-out strategy with a clear deadline, given the weight of coal in our energy mix. 2030 is definitely a realistic deadline. And second, we need more administrative capacity in this country to really make use of the multiple financial instruments that are available.
Jerzy.
Thanks. Czech Republic, we need a clear phase-out date and a strong strategy for renewables.
Perfect. Philip.
Building renewables, most essential task, I'd say.
And Dimitri.
Political will and nudging from the public, which means the public needs to be aware of all those things, and harmony in the political parties in Greece, at least.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this quick round. We got very interesting bullets and all very relevant and valid. Yeah, thereby I would like to thank the panelists. Thanks for taking your time, looking into our paper and presenting on your national situation and presenting on the Commission's view. Thanks a lot for this. I hope next time to meet you in person. However, this was a very efficient webinar, which also has its benefits. So thereby I would hand over to Michaela, who's wrapping up the whole webinar for us. Thanks a lot.
Hi, everybody. I'm reappearing after a nice panel discussion. And if I may wrap up for everyone what I take from it. Even though the coal phase out, as Francesco said, has been going on for a long time, it seems that actually it's not yet a done deal. So even if our net zero modeling tell us what it should be, we've seen when we did our little trip around Europe that there really would need to be a final push. Even if it's the most obvious sector to decarbonize. And what I also took from it is that only a price signal alone might not be enough if you want to have really an overall cost-effective pathway and need to build the energy system of the future. And that for me is very important with a view to the ongoing revision of the state aid guidelines, where I think it's very important that they would allow member states to have this room to plan the energy system of the future. Just to give one keyword is that, for example, they should be without unnecessarily being burdened, be able to do a technology-specific auction, for example, if you want to deploy large-scale PV in a coal mine. So this, I think, is an important aspect. And what I appreciate, because as someone who has worked previously on renewables policies, is that somehow, whatever topic we're discussing these days, say hydrogen or etc., it always comes back to the importance of renewables and the importance of clearing those bottlenecks. And I think that really is an important message also from this seminar, which came out quite clearly, in the last, you only have 2 words, comments. I think this is really central. And it is not by chance that the Commission has encouraged member states to scale up significantly renewables, for example, as part of their recovery plans. And it should be insisted upon while we get out of this crisis. I think that would be my personal wrap up of the session. And thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to the panelists.
And 2 minutes earlier than expected, I can take the microphone back, and we did manage. We will manage to finish on time, which is quite a challenge considering we have such a full panel. Thank you, everyone on the podium. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I believe we were able to answer almost all of them, either in writing or somehow taking them into the discussion. For everyone who's interested in reviewing or who would like to forward everything you heard today, the recording should be online in the course of the week. I should think maybe Thursday already. And of course, you still have the 2 presentations which were shown and the study itself. And if you're interested in being kept up to date with our upcoming events and the latest studies, I recommend, as usual, to register for our newsletter. And I believe Robin, and maybe Robin and everyone else on the podium can switch on the camera now, so we have the full Monty. Robin will put it into the chat again, because there will be more events coming. I think maybe 1 or 2 per week in the next week. And of course, there's going to be hydrogen, but also other topics. And thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Enjoy your lunch. And we're going to stay for another 10 seconds or so that being kicked out of the webinar is not so harsh. Bye-bye, everyone.